Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So it's now 3:30 and we can start this webinar. So I'm Gilles Leclercq from Castle Malting. I'm the R&D manager at Castle Malting, and my colleague here is Gabriel, an experienced brewer. So this webinar is going to be about specialty kilned malts. This webinar is part of a series of webinars. So it's supposed to be 12 webinars, one per month. That's the third one. That's 5 months. We're a bit late, I think, but we'll try to catch up. We'll see. So this third webinar is about kiln malts, and the previous was about caramel malts. The next one is about roasted malts. The one after will be about adjuncts, flakes, raw cereals. The idea is always to go from their production in the malt house to the use of this product in the breweries. So we think that it's going to be 1 hour. We'll try to stick to the schedule, including a Q&A session. If you have questions, even during the webinar, you can write them down on the right part of your screen. There's supposed to be a Q&A section. Please don't put these questions in the main chat, otherwise we will miss them at the end. We'll allocate some time at the end of the webinar to answer all the questions you might have regarding the production or regarding the use of this product in the brewery. So, just as a quick reminder, in 2020, it was a very special year for everyone. We at Castle Malting had much more time than usual to develop some new malts. We had more resources because some other project had to be stopped, and then. Well, we start developing new malts with the goal to reach 100 types of base and specialty malts by the end of 2020. That was quite a big goal to reach, but we did it. We're quite happy. The first webinar of this series is about introducing all these new products. If you want to have a look at it, it's on our YouTube channel. Here is an overview of the malts you can find in Castle Malting catalog. I like to start with this context because, as I introduced, we are in this first series of webinar introducing the malt per categories, then talking about the use of production, then use. So here is a big overview. As you can see, more than 100 types of base and specialty malts. We emphasize the development in 2020 on caramel malts, wheat malts, flakes and raw cereals, and also especially the organic malts. So quite a big development. Today is going to be about specialty kilned malts. So how do we produce these malts? Well, we had an overview about the products, the malts. Here is an overview about the process. So as you can see, the barley goes through steeping, germination, and kilning to produce the kilned malt. That's the topic of today. I'm going to talk a bit more about these 3 main steps of the process. We can also use a roaster, and we have 2 kinds of roasters that have been introduced in the previous webinar about the caramel malts, and that will be also introduced in the next webinar about the roasted malts. So as you can see here with the roaster, we can produce some roasted malt, obviously, or some roasted barley, or some caramel malts, and each of these malt category is the topic of one webinar. So as I just said, today is not going to be about roasters. Today is about the traditional malting process, the base one, I would say. So 3 steps: steeping, germination, and kilning. And I'm going to go a bit deeper into the details of this process As explained here, well, it can look easy. It can look very simple to steep, germinate, and kiln, but in fact is full of parameters that can be adapted. I like to remember the brewers that the barley is a very valuable product. It's a valuable raw product. A lot of parameters are varying a lot across years, across varieties, across harvest, and that's the job of the maltster, to absorb this variability, to provide a constant product, a constant malt to brewers, so he can do his job and not being worried about absorbing variation. So all the parameters that we change during the process is to absorb this variability. Steeping. So the first step, we always start with water. It's just like when you are growing plants, you have to add water to your seeds. Well, here it's the same. The duration is between 28 and 34 hours. Why is that varying so much? Well, there are multiple parameters that can explain that. Well, it depends on the steeping process, the equipment we have. Steeping could be run within a day. It's not possible at Castle Malting because we don't have the equipment for that, but it's really depends on the equipment you have. That's the first point. Then it depends on the water temperature you're going to use for steeping. It will also depend on the barley water sensitivity. That means the ability of the barley to absorb water quickly or not. So it will make your process longer or shorter. And this makes your climate, well, it's something that is usually a bit overlooked, is the fact that we can run an additional seed cleaning. With the water, we can remove the dust, some husk tannins that are present in the husk of the barley, so we can remove these polyphenols. We can also, and that's the main objective, hydrate the embryo and the endosperm. So this hydration will make the kernels germinate. The idea is to have a very uniform germination, well, to initiate an uniform germination. And it's important, the word uniform here, because the process is run for all the kernels of the batch together. And that's why we have to be so strict about the parameters and how we run the process, because we have to make it as homogeneous as possible. So in practice, regarding the process, it will be an alternance of different phases that we call immersion or soaks and air rest. So during the immersion that you can see on the picture, we run a continuous bubbling, roasting. And why do we do that? Well, that's for different points. The first is that the barley will quickly absorb the oxygen that is dissolved in the water, and we have to solve that problem by continuous bubbling. So we will send some new oxygen and we'll try to remove the carbon dioxide, because, as I like to remember, the barley is not a fish. So it's not meant to live inside water. The water here is just to be absorbed by the kernels, and then we will have to make a hair rest, provide a hair rest to make sure that the barley doesn't suffocate. So during the air rest, the barley kernels will keep their respiration going on, and we have to evacuate this carbon dioxide due to the respiration. That's why we have a constant airflow during the air rest during this step. I will say also that this is the most important step among the three main steps of malting, because once this step is done, everything is almost fixed for what's coming next. So for example, if the water uptake at the end of the steeping step is too low, there will be no efficient modification during the germination. If the water uptake is too high, then your kernels will die or they will germinate too quickly. So in both cases, that's a huge problem. You need to reach the water uptake that you aim for each type of malts. So the water uptake might be higher for specialty malts than for base malts. That's also a good information. So we have a target and we need to reach it in order to make sure that the following steps of the malting process will go on smoothly. The next step is germination. So what is funny is that, in fact, germination starts before. It starts during steeping. That's the idea. That's to initiate germination, but physiologically, the germination starts at the end of steeping. So this step is much longer. That's the longest step among the three. It will last 4 to 6 days on average. At castle malting, it's more 4 days. The objective, well, that's even the main objective of the malting process. That's to produce and activate enzymes. That's what we do as maltsters, basically. That's production and activation of enzymes. Otherwise, I mean, you could be using barley or raw cereals directly, but there is no enzymes. So you cannot do that. To produce alcohol from a cereal, you need these enzymes, and these enzymes are produced and activate through the malting process. So that's the main objective. Obviously, there are also some, let's say not side effects, but some other changes, some other modifications thanks to the malting process that are also very useful for the brewers. So we will, for example, break up the cell walls and the proteins of the endosperm so you can access the starch as brewers. We will also modify the grain reserves to reach an optimal profile of proteins, polypeptides, and amino acids. So you need all these three as brewers to feed the yeast, to provide a good foam stability for several reasons. You need proteins, polypeptides, and amino acids. So thanks to the malting process, we'll be able to reach an optimal profile among these three. So the idea is to promote chemical breakup while limiting the physiological development. So if you look at the pictures on the right, the one at the top is what we call that's the chit barley. We can call it that way. So that's the barley at the end of the steeping. So at the beginning of the germination, as you can see, the white dots, they are the first appearance of the roots. So we will count for a sample of 100 kernels the number of these appearance of first roots, and we will call it the chit percentage. And the chit percentage will give you basically the number of grains that are able to germinate correctly. If you don't have this appearance, that means that the grain either died or had some problem, that the embryo is not alive. So the idea is that all the highest percentage possible must be reached thanks to the steeping process. The picture in the middle is what you have at the end of the germination. So what you see in white are the rootlets that are, I would say, as long as the kernel itself. And the bottom picture here is to give you an example. So 4 days of germination. On day 4, you can see that the rootlets are as long as the kernel, but not too long. On day 5, it's already a kernel that is way too modified. You can see that the rootlets are too long and that the acrospire, so the first leaf, it's already coming out of the kernel. And that we do not want. We have to stop before, because otherwise the kernel will start to kind of eat its reserves, meaning starch, so no starch, less extract from the brew for the brewers. So that's more problems that we do not want. So we have to reach this optimal modification through through germination, but everything is kind of conditioned by a good steeping. So here is a picture of the inside of a kernel. You can see at the top the embryo. The embryo is like for humans. That's the origin of life. I'll say that from the embryo, you will get the rootlets and you will get the acrospire, obviously in the opposite direction, because one is meant to go to the top and one is going to the ground. So rootlets and acrospire from the embryo. The husk is there to protect the kernel, so it's just like the skin for humans. I think that's a good comparison. And then the endosperm is where you find the starch granule that are enclosed into a protein matrix. So basically, that's the kernel resources to grow. So that was a picture, but here is a drawing to make you understand more easily what we cannot see on a picture. So here we find the same terms. So the husk, the rootlets, the acrospire. So that is the first leaf. There is also the hyaluron layer. So the hyaluron layer is the main tissue where the enzymes will be produced and released into the endosperm. And what you can see at the bottom of the picture, so if you look at the bottom right, we have here that's kind of a zoom of the cell membrane in which we will find some starch granules, big and smalls, enclosed in a protein matrix. So bottom right is the endosperm before malting. The objective of the malting process is to modify that structure. What we will do first through steeping is to hydrate the cell membrane and the protein matrix. What will result through the germination step is that we will break up the cell membranes and the protein matrix so the starch granules can be accessible to the brewers. So here is the equipment we have at Castle Malting. That's very usual, common Saladin boxes. So it was this French engineer called Charles Saladin, and it was called by his name. So it's Saladin germination box. We have these screw turning machines to avoid the rootlets to mate. Otherwise, we would have some very compact zones inside this layer. And in these compact zones, the heat will increase. And also the CO2, the carbon dioxide, will be much too present. So the idea is to make this layer homogeneous and avoid the rootlets to mate thanks to this turning machine. So that was about germination. All right, yeah, germination. Here is the third step, kilning. I'm going to talk a bit more about kilning because kilning is what really makes the difference between the different types of specialty malts. So kilning can be 1 or 2 days, usually depending if you have a single or a double deck kiln. I'm going to talk a bit more about this equipment. What's the objective of kilning? Well, I will say the first idea is to stabilize the product. Stabilize, I mean that the green malt at the end of the germination, basically you have almost everything you need. You have the enzymes, the body has been modified. You could brew basically with green malt. Technically, it's possible. There are some drawbacks, but we are not going to go into that topic today. But basically, green malt is already ready for brewing. but we have to stabilize it because the shelf life is super short. I mean, it's more than 40% moisture, so it's not stable. So kilning can be used to stabilize the product. With the temperature, we'll stop the germination, we will kill the embryo, and we will reduce the moisture to 4-5%. So you can have a shelf life for 1-2 years for your malts. It will also allow to have a much better friability with this reduced moisture. And most importantly, well, at least it's also important, we will preserve the enzyme activity at the best of our abilities for the base malts, at least. So this enzyme activity, as you know, is much more important for the base malt. And as the temperature increases during kilning, we'll start losing this part of this enzyme activity. But so that was about stabilizing the product. But we can also, and that's what we do when we produce specialty malts, we can develop colors and flavors. How do we do that? Well, basically we rise the temperature and we have different recipes. As you have different recipes in your brew house, we have different recipes in our malt house to produce different kind of specialty malts. And the last objective is to remove some off flavors such as the DMS. I'm going to talk just a bit about that. In practice, how do we kiln our malts? Well, we have a double deck kiln. It looks like that. So 2 decks, 2 days, 2 purposes. So the upper deck is for day 1. Day 1 is for evaporation. The lower deck is for day 2 and is for curing. And what we will do is to send a constant airflow by the bottom of the lower deck. So each day there are three things happening. The lower deck is empty to go to the decilming machine, and then the malt is finished and stored into silos. The upper deck is empty to go to the lower deck, and the upper deck is filled with a batch of green malt from the latest germination box. So that's what's happening every day and every day. So we have in this process a 2-day kilning cycle. The parameters that can be adapted are, well, there are a lot of them. First, there is the airflow. How much air are we going to send through these layers? There is the air temperature, the duration of each rise in temperature. That is also very important. The air moisture and the recirculation of this air. So at the beginning, the product is very humid. It's more than 40% humidity. So what we'll do is to send some new air from outside all the time, because we cannot recirculate humid air to dry a product. It will be nonsense. But at the end, as the product starts drying, well, then we can recirculate the air and start saving energy. Also, obviously, all of these 3 steps in the malting process are very linked. So the moisture of the green malt will have an impact on the type of malt that we want to produce. So long story short, if you want to produce a specialty kilned malt compared to a base malt, you want to achieve more moisture at the end of the steeping and more moisture also at the end of the germination. You want to reach usually a higher modification than for the base malts. So the maltster can adjust all these parameters to produce a very wide range of malts that all have different flavors. Here is a diagram about single deck kilned compared to double deck kilned. I'm not going to go into detail about not going to go too much into details about these comparison. Just remember that the idea of double deck kiln is to save energy. So the airflow go through the first layer, then it decreases in temperature, and then it goes to the second layer. So if we would be using a single deck, that means that at the beginning, when we use pure new air from outside, we will release this energy outside, and it will be a loss. But here we are saving it for evaporation on the upper deck. So huge amount of energy saved to this kind of kilning. So here's a graph, just to give you an example of the different steps during kilning. It's quite old graph, so not very up to date. For example, H is it's withering phase, not whitering phase, but the withering phase is not performed anymore. It's quite archaic. The idea was to have this additional step between germination and kilning. And the idea was to stop the airflow and to leave the layer heating. Because if you stop all the parameters during germination, because of the activity of the kernels, the heat will start to increase. So the idea of the withering phase was to leave the malt heat by itself. It's not performed anymore. We start directly at the free drying phase. So as you see on the graph, we will provide constant temperature and to allow the upper layer to dry. And then what we will notice, thanks to a probe that is located above the upper layer, we will, thanks to this probe, measure the water relative moisture, relative humidity, and the temperature of the air going through the layer. And once it will start to decrease in terms of humidity and increase in terms of temperature, then we will know that this layer kind of loses its resistance, and it will start increasing the temperature to reach the curing phase. And the curing phase is basically the phase that is adapted to produce the different kind of specialty malts. I don't say that the previous steps are not adapted to the kind of malts that we want to produce, but the curing phase is really the main element that is changed to produce the different type of malts. Basically, the temperature of the curing phase will determine the type of malt that we produce. And it's from, I'll say, 82 degrees for Pilsen malt to 125 degrees for a cafe light. It's between that range. So just a short word about enzymes activity during kilning, because I think it's very interesting to know what you win and what you lose thanks to kilning. So on the left are the enzymes that will decrease during kilning. So we can lose, I will say, up to 60% of the beta amylase because of kilning, because of the heat. And that's not really a problem, because there are still enough of this beta amylase to provide an efficient starch conversion. But it can be sometimes useful to conserve more beta amylase. For example, if you want to use much more raw cereals, it will be useful to have more of these beta amylase. And also, it's more linked to the lowering phase, but during brewing, but we lose a lot of beta glucanase because of this kilning phase. What will increase are the alpha amylase, endopeptidase, and carbopeptidase. It's quite relative, because the alpha amylase increase, it's increasing in the beginning of the kilning process, but then it's decreasing again to reach almost the same level as the beginning. So the increase is not really that high for the alpha amylase. What you can remember is that because of the kilning, we will lose overall the ability, well, part of the ability to convert to starch. So the enzymes such as the beta amylase and the alpha amylase, overall, we have a loss. And we have also an impact on the loitering activity. So what we know is that if you had green malt, it's not practiced, but if you had green malt to a brew, you will considerably improve your loitering phase. It will be much faster because, in fact, you had a huge amount of beta-glucanase that also can be useful for the loitering phase. So that was just for your information, because you are not brewing with green malt, you are brewing with kilned malt. Also about kilning, what we said is that it's very useful to remove some of the off flavors. So a very famous one is the DMS, the dimethyl sulfide, that will impart some cooked corn, black olive flavors that are not, well, usually not desired into your beer. So what's happening is that during germination, we produce the DMS precursor that is called S-methylmethionine, SMM, and during kilning, we will form some DMS, and as the temperature increases, we will start to remove it. So that's why we have to run this last curing phase, even for base malt, even for Pilsen malt, we have to reach about 80 degrees to remove the DMS. Otherwise, we will be producing what we call a distilling malt. That is, in fact, the way to preserve most of the beta amylase, but not removing the DMS. So that's for distillers, it's useful, but not for brewers. Also here, the kilning, as we said before, it's very useful to provide already some very good flavors. You don't need a roaster to produce specialty malts. Obviously, it's better because the range of specialty malts that you can produce, it's much bigger with a roaster. But you can also produce some pretty good specialty malts with a kiln. For example, here are some flavors that can be imparted to your beer thanks to a kilning process. They are mostly caused by what we call the Maillard reaction. So the Maillard reaction are happening between sugars and amino acids at quite high temperatures, so above 90 degrees. So here are examples of flavors that basically hundreds, probably maybe thousands of components that are responsible for these kind of flavors. Not going to talk much about that because it could be a whole webinar about all the flavors that are developed for in each specialty malt. Maybe regarding the process, before I let my colleague Gabriel talk about the use of these specialty malts, I think it's good to remember that kilning is very different compared to the caramelization. So we have here two kind of non-enzymatic browning reactions, but they are not the same. So during kilning, it's the Maillard reactions. They are non-enzymatic, and it's happening between sugars and amino acids. It's close, but it's not the same to the caramelization. The caramelization, what's good to remember is that we need a very efficient saccharification. Just like brewing. When you brew, when you do your mashing, you sacharify. But basically, when we produce caramel malt, we do the same. We take the green malt, we have a very high moisture inside each kernel, and we sacharify the inside of the kernels to produce simple sugars, the glucose, and we will reassemble them to caramelize the inside of the kernel. And this reassembling, it's called polymerization, and it's basically the caramelization. I try to explain it very shortly and very simply, but we have a whole webinar about caramelization and that is, I think, webinar number 2. So the previous one, yeah, confirm, good. So webinar number 2 is about the caramel malts. If you want to have a look at it, it's on our YouTube channel. So just be careful when you want to use caramel malts. If they are produced on a kiln, you can be sure that they won't be good quality. So we don't produce caramel malts on kiln at Castle Malting because it's very difficult to have a very efficient saccharification on a kiln. The way you play with the moisture level is way too hard on a kiln. And here are two, as you can see on the picture, the bottom picture, you can see the inside of the kiln. It is very different for a production on the kiln or in a roaster. So here is the range of our specialty kiln malts. We have 8 of them, and we have 5 additional base malts that are produced on a kiln. Obviously, some other malts are produced on a kiln, such as the smoked malts, but they are not included here. They are on the topic of the second webinar about roasted and smoked malts. But the 8 specialty kiln malts, they are here. I'm not going to present each one of them. I think most of you know these malts, but I will let my colleague Gabriel speak about the brewing tips and some useful information with these malts. Thanks, and I remain here at your disposal if you have questions at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill, for your presentation. It was very nice. Hello, everyone. Now I'm going to present a short presentation about brewing with kiln malts. Just before I move forward, I'd just like to remember, if you have any questions, please ask in the Q&A session of our chat. It's just next to the main chat. There's a Q&A part. In the end of the webinar, we're going to take a look at them, of all of those questions, and we can have a small chat. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about of the use of caramel malts in the brewing is why to use them. I know that it's quite simple and many of you already know, but it's always good to remember. And the main reason of using kiln malts or any other specialty malts is to bring color, aromas, and flavor to the beer. And this is going to depend the type of specialty malt, the type of kiln malt you're using. As Jill presented, here in Casa Malting, we have a range of 8 different kiln malts. And depending on the level of kilning, we're going to have different flavors. If you're using a more lightly kiln malt, we're going to have more soft flavors, something like bready, some biscuit flavors, lower colors as well. But if we're using highly kiln malt, we're going to have more intense flavors, more malty flavors, more Maillard reactions, and also this malt is going to be darker, and also is going to be more color in the beer if you brew with this type of malt. The second reason to brew with kiln malts, it's to brew different traditional beers. For example, you could use Munich malt to brew very traditional German beers. This type of malt is very traditional in German beers, like, for example, the Munich Helles, the Munich Dunkel. It's very good malt to brew those type of beers. We also could use the Chateau Abbey. It's a very special Belgian malt. It's very useful once you're brewing traditional Belgian beers like double, triples. It's a quite very intense and quite characteristic malt for Belgian beers. And also we could use a malt called Melano, which kind of mimics the same flavors that we can achieve with the decoction process in the brew house. Nowadays, many of the breweries, they do not perform more this step in the brew house. And if you use Chateau Melano, you can achieve kind of the same flavors, the same Maillard intense flavors after that process. Another reason to use the kiln malts, and we need to remember once we're designing a beer, once we're brewing with this type of malts, is that these malts, they have fermentable sugars and they also have enzyme activity. They have some diastatic power. So obviously this is going to depend on the level of the kilning. I'm talking about more light kiln malts, not the high kiln ones. With the light kilning, we're gonna preserve more enzymes as the Jill just presented, and this is gonna have some impact in our brewing process. We're gonna have a faster saccharification, meaning that we're gonna have a shorter mashing protocol, a shortened brew day. This is very good to have a more stable, sensory stable beer in the end. We also can have a simple mash profile. We're going to talk about this in the next slides. It's very good to brew with brewing adjuncts. It's quite excellent to brew with them because of these extra enzymes we have in the mashing scheme. It's always useful because normally brewing adjuncts, they do not have many enzymes. Um, Also, we can brew worts with a very high degree of fermentation using this type of malts, and also bring a lot of different colors and flavors to the beer, to the brew. And once we're brewing with this type of malts, it's quite easy to balance the maltiness from this type of malt with hops and the alcohol level of the beer. So it's not that difficult. These type of malts, they're not going to bring extra body to the beer. It's quite simple to balance the final flavor of the beer. One question that I get very often from home brewers, or sometimes people that is just in the beginning of their brewing careers, is that what is the main difference between kiln malts and the other type of malts? So here I have a very simple way to answer this question. Here I have presented the four main types of malts we can find in Casa Malting. We have the base malts and we have the specialty malts. Specialty malts are going to be divided into kiln malts, caramel malts, and roasted malts. Obviously, all of them are going to have some difference in flavors and aromas, but I also would like to highlight the difference in the composition. So the base malts, they're going to bring most of the fermentable sugars and enzymes to the brew. The kiln malts, they're going to bring the colors, flavors, and aroma that I was just talking about, but also they're going to bring fermentable sugars and enzymes. This is very important because this is quite different from what caramel malts and roasted malts will bring to the process. Caramel malts, they have only unfermentable sugars, they have no enzymes. This is very important to remember. So we have a kind of a limit in the grain bill that we can use them, normally up to 30%. And also the roasted malts, they also bring unfermentable sugars to the brew, and they also have no enzymes. And the suggested use of them, it's up to 10%, more or less. So once we're brewing with these different types of malts, it's always good to remember they have different compositions, not only difference in flavors. Now I'm going to share a few ideas on brewing with kiln malts. I'm going to share a few tips on how to brew with them. And the first thing we need to do is to decide the beer style we're going to brew. Once we have the beer style that we're going to brew, we can decide the recipe we're going to have, the beer recipe we're going to have, and also the grain bill that we're going to use. We're going to split this grain bill in two main categories, the base malt and the specialty malts. And in the specialty malts, we're going to have the kiln malts. So we're going to play with this percentage of base malt and percentage of kiln malts. Because these two malts, the base malt and the kiln malts, they're quite similar in composition. We can weight all of them together, we can mill all of them together, and we can mash in all of them together. These kiln malts, they're gonna bring flavors and colors and aromas, as I said before. They're not gonna bring extra viscosity, as some caramel malts could bring to the process. And also they will not bring some acidity or astringency that is very common once we're using roasted malts, especially once you're going to use a high percentage of roasted malts in your mashing protocol. You can have some acidity or some astringency. It's very important to remember this. Also, we can play with the water chemistry once we're brewing different beers. Once we're brewing with kiln malts, only in a recipe with base malt and kiln malts, we do not need to adjust the water chemistry. to reach the mash pH, the desirable mash pH. We only need to adjust the water chemistry once we're going to brew different beer styles. If you want to play with different beer styles, you might need to adjust, but not because you're using kiln malts. It's desirable that we reach a mash pH of 5.2 to 5.6 because this mash pH is the best range for the enzymes that you're going to have in the mash to work on the things they need to break down proteins or starch. And so in this mash pH, we're going to have the most of the activity of these enzymes. Also, it's good to remember the mix ratio you can use once you're brewing. The liters of water, brewing water with the kilograms of malt. I suggest to keep in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 liters of water per kilograms of malt. But obviously, this is going to depend the type of technology you're using to filter your beer, to filter your wort. If you're using a mash filter, if you have a high capacity brewery, you can use lower ratio because you're going to need to concentrate more your grist. But if you're using a lauterton, if you're lautering the wort, you can go up to 3.5 liters of water per kilograms of malt. And I suggest to keep in this range because this also affects the enzyme activity and also it will affect the sparge volume you're going to use. So in the end, you're going to have some effects, you're going to have some impact in the efficiency of your brew house. So I suggest to keep in this range, 2.5 to 3.5. Here, I'm going to talk a bit about the temperature profile you can use in your mashing protocol. I have a graph with all the main enzymes you have in the malt and you have in your mashing. The enzymes that are going to break all the gums in your malt, in your grist, going to break the proteins and also the enzymes responsible for doing the saccharification of your starch. If you're using kiln malts, you will only need to focus on the saccharification enzymes, meaning that you're gonna be able to mash in higher temperatures from 63 degrees, and you have a shorter mashing protocol. You have a shortened brew day, and also you're gonna have a more stable, sensory stable product in the end. These kiln malts from Casa Malts are well modified malts, and I always suggest if you have a grist of 100% malt, uh, base malt and kiln malts, I always suggest to only focus in the saccharification enzymes. If you bring some adjuncts to your beer, to your grist, or if you're using unmodified malts, you're going to need to do some protein rests, and sometimes you're also going to need to do some gum rests. You're going to increase the time that you're going to spend your mashing protocol, your mashing, because you're going to need to break down all that matrix that surrounds the starch before you'll be able to let enzymes work on the starch. Okay, so this is very important. So if you have base malt and kiln malts, I suggest you only focus on the saccharification enzymes, so you can mash in higher temperatures. And finally here, I have a table with all the range of kiln malts that we have here in Casa Malting. They are ranked by the suggested percentage of use you can use in your grain bill. And this suggestion is based on their flavor intensity, but also in their diastatic power. So for example, Chateau Munich Light, which is the first one in this table, we suggest you use up to 60% of your grain bill, mixing with 40% of base malt, because this type of malt, the Chateau Munich Light, this type of malt, they have lighter flavors than the other ones, and also they have more diastatic power once you're compared to the other malts. While, for example, the Chateau Café Light has much more intense flavors and have no diastatic power at all. So we only suggest to use up to 10% of your grist. Of course, this will depend on your whole grain bill. If you have other specialty malts in your grist, or if you're brewing with adjuncts, these numbers might change. All this information you can find online in our website. Each one of these malts, they have a spec sheet. You can take a look on the spec sheet to have all the details about the malts, and as well these numbers, the suggestion of use, and also the styles that you can brew with the different type of malts. Okay, so now I'm gonna give you a few examples of beer styles that you can use, that you can brew using these kiln malts. And the first beer styles that I'm gonna talk about, they're the ones we can brew with the Chateau Munich. This malt is quite intense malt, has a lot of malty flavors, a lot of Maillard flavors. It's quite good malt, and we can use 15 to 20% of this malt to brew Munich Helles. For example, to add some malt character to this beer. This beer is normally very drinkable, a pale beer. Also, you can use this malt to increase a bit of the color, to give a bit more golden color. We can use 40 to 60% of Munich malt in a German Marzen, for example, to round up the malt character of this beer, to make this beer a bit more malty. And in fact, this style quite emphasize the Munich malt. You can once you're drinking this style, you're gonna see all the power of the Munich malt. And talking about the power of Munich malt, you can go up to 100% in a Munich Dunkel, and then you're gonna have a very malty, rich beer with dark amber color. It is a very good beer. It's quite drinkable, although it's quite full. It's a quite fuller beer, but it's very drinkable. We also can use the Chateau Melano to brew some beers. For example, you could use this malt to brew amber lager. I suggest to use only 3 to 8% of the grain bill in this type of beer, only to add color to the beer. This malt is quite strong. It's known as well as a Turbo Munich, so it's a very malty, rich type of malt. And I suggest only to use just a bit, just to increase the color. Do not add much flavors to the beer. We can use 10 to 15% in an English porter. As I said before, to bring some decoction flavors to this beer style, English porter, round up the malt character of this beer. And we can use 15 to 20% in a double bock to increase the color of this beer, and also to increase the malt character of this beer. Bring a lot of sweetness, malt sweetness to this beer style. Also, I'm gonna talk a bit about the Chateau Abbey, which is our Belgian type of malt. It's a beautiful malt. It matches perfectly with the traditional Belgian beers. We can use up to 10% of this malt in the grain bill of a Belgian triple to balance out the fruitiness of this beer style, to add some maltiness and balance those fruity notes from the yeast, and also the alcohol level of this beer. The same for the Belgian quadruple. We can use 10 to 20% of this malt along with other dark malts to make this beer very complex, to balance the high alcohol level of this beer. It is a very good malt to do this. And also, it's not very traditional, but I quite like, to be honest, add 5 to 15% in an English brown ale. As I said, it's not very traditional, but I think rounds up the malt character of the English beers very well. Okay, so now I'm gonna share a full recipe with you, not only briefly talk about them, but I'm gonna share a full recipe where we can use different kiln malts to brew a very complex beer. I'm gonna talk about the Belgian Double. So this beer style was born in Belgium, of course, in the monasteries in the Middle Ages. And the traditional ingredients we can use to brew this beer, they're quite vast. To be honest, normally this type of beer has a very complex grain bill, full of different specialty malts, along with the base malt. But to brew this beer, we use a lot of specialty malts. We also use sugar. Normally, we use candy sugar. It's a very Belgian sugar to increase the alcohol level of these beers, but also to bring the flavors of the candy sugars. Uh, it's used noble hops as well to brew this beer, and of course, we use a Belgian yeast strain to do the fermentation and promote all the esteries, all the spiciness from this type of yeast. The the beer profile of this beer is quite complex. It matches perfectly with the ingredients that it used. This beer is quite malty. It's very rich. Um, you can find some sweet notes, a full body. Sometimes, depending on the malts you're using, the specialty malts you're gonna use, you can find hints of chocolate malt, hints of roasted malts. They pair perfectly with this type of beer. This beer is quite estery as well because of the Belgian yeast we're using. And normally this beer have almost no hops aroma and only a moderate bitterness just to balance the big body, the big maltiness of this beer style. So this is the recipe. If you go online, if you go to our website, we have more than 40 different recipes. You can find this one there as well. So you can take a look and maybe even brew this recipe or just be inspired to come up with your own recipe. And as you see here in the malt bill, I use two different types of kiln malts. I use the Abbey malt, 20% of the grain bill, and I also use a Melano malt, 10% of the grain bill. And following this scheme, this whole scheme and the ingredients as well, you're gonna brew 100 liters, 1 hectoliter of beer, 7% alcohol, 50 EBC in color, and 20 IBU in bitterness. Is a very good beer. And also here, if you take a look on, it's the wrong name here. It's called spices, but it should be sugar. It's called Candy Sugar Dark. As I said before, it's quite traditional for Belgian beers, and just not only to increase the alcohol level of the beers, but also to bring the candy flavors and the candy taste to the beer. If you follow the scheme, you can take a look online. I'm not gonna spend much time. It's all detailed. You follow a conventional mashing protocol. You do not a very long boil, 75 minutes. You do the fermentation. It's very important for Belgian beers to focus a lot on the fermentations. You can even go to a higher temperatures to stress a bit of this Belgian strain yeast to promote more ester production. And you only carbonate up to 2.8 volumes of CO2, and then this beer is ready to go. And if you brew this beer or any others in our website, please let me know and also send me a bottle. I'll be very happy to taste your beer. So that's it. Thank you very much for being here with us. I hope this webinar was very useful for you. You learn a bit about the kiln malts and brewing production with them. And hopefully you're going to be a bit inspired. And as I said before, please send me your beers so I can taste whatever you brew. Thank you very much.
Well, at least send your comments about the recipes. Yeah, maybe we can allow some time for questions. I've seen that there are a few of them. The first one was about water quality for steeping. So we don't use tap water. Well, we have a well at the historical production plant in Belleuil. So all the water we use for steeping comes from that well. pH is about 6.1. That is quite high for for water to be used for steeping, but we have no choice as in this area in Belgium. That's the case for everywhere. I mean, there is only one part in Belgium, if you're in the south, what we call the Ardennes, where the pH is really low, close to 5 and even below that. And but there is no malt house over there. There's just trees, cows, and yeah, no crops. Very bad soil. So yeah, pH is 6.1. And regarding the ionic content, well, we ran a full analysis of this water regularly, and water is really clean because it comes from quite a deep well. So we never encountered any problem with the composition, the mineral composition of the water. It's quite clean. So yeah, no problem regarding that. We more important than the composition, I think, well, the mineral composition is the temperature of the water for steeping. So as you know, or as you probably know, if you use water that is well, with a higher temperature, water absorption will be quicker. We are kind of in the middle range. We are around 40 degrees for the temperature for steeping. So we could heat the water a little bit to have a quicker steeping process, but we don't do that. So yeah, we play with these parameters, but not too much because it's quite hard to heat such a volume of water as well. I mean, it's about 100 cubic meter of water per immersion. So that's huge. So it will be also, I mean, environmentally, it will be also a loss of energy because it's not entirely necessary. I think the second question is for you, Gabriel, regarding the
Yeah, I asked a question.
whiskey distilling.
No, someone, Peter from, I think from Ireland, asked this question. Asked us to talk a bit more about the whiskey distilling malts, and actually, what is the difference between distilling malt and the other type of malts? And I just posted here to remember to talk about this in the end. So the main difference, as Jill said in his presentation, I think he just said briefly, is the kilning temperature. Normally, to produce distilling malts, you want to preserve more the enzymes at the end of the process. So you're going to use more gentle temperatures to kiln those malts, preserving more enzymes, because once you're brewing the wort to produce to produce whiskey, you want to produce as much as possible fermentable sugars to, in the end, to produce more alcohol. And then once you're doing the distilling, you're going to extract more alcohol from this batch. So that is the main difference. So you kiln in lighter temperatures to preserve more the enzymes. Am I right, Jill?
Yeah, that's right. We skipped we lower the temperature of the curing phase to preserve more the enzymes. Yes, that's right. What most difference between Munich Light from Caraclère? Well, regarding the process, that's completely different categories of malts. So composition will be different. Everything is different between these malts. But if you take for the same color one malt from the caramel category or from the kiln category, remember that there are very, very strong differences, such as the enzymatic power is really high for the kiln, really low for the caramel, and everything will be different also regarding the technical purpose for your caramels. You're gonna enhance the head formation and retention. But the purpose is not the same. You're not gonna brew a beer with 100% caramels of low coloration, but you can do it with a kiln malt of low coloration. I think Gabriel quite explained very well this difference. Maybe
Yeah.
you want to add something.
No, on top of what you said, they are totally different malts in the sense one is caramel malt and the other one is kiln. So the process to produce them it's quite different. But once you're brewing, if you're using them as a specialty malt, for example, 10-20% in your grist, the Munich Light is gonna enhance the maltiness in this beer, but is gonna bring a lot of fermentable sugars. While the Caracler is a caramel malt, it will bring a lot of unfermentable sugars, meaning that in the end you're gonna have a fuller body beer if you brew with Caracler. And if you go for the same OG, for example, 12 Plato, you're gonna end up with a higher FG, so less alcohol because you're bringing more unfermentable sugars to the beer. And as you said, they are quite in the same range of color, but they will have different impacts on the brewing process.
Good. Next question is about honey aroma flavors in beers. Which malt could be used to reach these kind of flavors?
Good,
That's a good one.
good question.
I'll say, don't use malt, use honey. but yeah, some I guess the Cara malts. We even have a malt called the Cara honey because it brings a lot of non-fermentable sugars like any other Cara. But well, the honey term in this case was more linked to the color. We think of this malt, but you can bring some body, some sweetness, but if you really want the honey flavors, I think the best way is to add some honey. That also has a lot of fermentable sugars, so it needs to be taken into account. And I also worked as a beekeeper, so I can say that the honey composition might vary a lot. So if you got some glucose and fructose that are very quickly fermented, that's okay, but you can also get some unfermentable sugars, and the proportion might vary across different honeys, so it needs to be taken into account. Also run a few tests before producing too much of it to avoid explosions.
Yeah, I completely agree. If you want to brew a beer full of honey flavors, I can suggest to add honey in the end of the boil. It's good to sterilize the honey 5 minutes before the end of the boil, or maybe even in the whirlpool. Of course, you're gonna lose some flavors because you're gonna boil off some flavors because of the high temperature. And if you go to the malt to try to have these notes in your beer, you're probably gonna go look into Cara malts, as Jill said, and we have the Cara honey. It's a very good malt and that you can use to bring those sweet notes that are gonna resemble some honey notes. And if you don't want to brew with Cara malt, I would say to brew with the Melano. Just use a bit of Melano in your beer. But of course, Melano is quite high in color, so this beer is going to be more amber than blonde. But you need to play with the percentage of this type of malt. But if it was me, I would go into the caramel malts to resemble the honey flavors.
Okay. And there is one last question about the recipe that you presented. Gabriel, maybe I will leave that question to you as it is more linked to brewing.
Best take always for hitting a great double. I find that it is really difficult style to nail. In the malt, sugar, candy, or yeast, temperature, and the most important player. Also favorite yeast. Okay, good, very good question. Indeed, it's a very difficult style to brew because of the higher amount of alcohol and the very complex grain bill. Sometimes we get in troubles with this complex grain bill. Sometimes as a brewer or even a home brewer, you can get some stuck mashes, and the filtration might be quite tricky. But my remarks would be to do a good complex grain bill, maybe not over 4 different specialty malts. So in total, it would be 5 different specialty, 5 different malts in your grain bill. I think it's kind of the limit. Try to always use malt. Do not use any adjuncts to make the smashing protocol a bit more easier for you. And focus a lot in the fermentation side. So this is the key. This is the success key in Belgian beers. Play with the yeast. Choose a very good yeast, Belgian strain. I think from Fermentis, the T58 is a good yeast. You can play with it. Play with the temperatures. You have to have a good fermentation control to play with the to play with the temperatures. Sorry. I think that's the key for a success for a double. You have to really control your fermentation temperatures, the times as well. I don't know your equipment you're using, if you're a home brewer or a brewer, but if you're able to track the attenuation throughout the fermentation, I think it's a good thing to do. Do not try to control this fermentation by time, because sometimes you're going to have some autolysis. You might over ferment your beer. This is not ideal. Always try to track the attenuation of the extract, and then you can make your best decisions in the fermentation side. That's my marks. I think focus a lot in the fermentation and in the yeast.
Okay, good. Castle Malting showed I have honey malt as well. This was a remark. Honey malt, yeah. I think the name is catchy, to be honest. That's why we have a Cara honey. But I don't think that even for the competitors, the name Cara, the name honey malt, it's catchy, but try to brew with it. I don't think you can find some very honey flavors. Sweet flavors, yes, certainly. But honey flavors from a malt, it's remember that honey flavors, they come from flowers, and we brew, well, mostly with barley. Barley are cereals, flowers. It's not the same family of flavors.
This is when we go into the sommelier part, where we need to describe a beer, and you kind of need to come up with different descriptions and sensations, and then these words, they appear.
Yeah, true. Well, thank you for your question. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention. And we will keep you in touch regarding the next webinar. It's going to be about roasted and smoked malts. How do we produce them and how to use them at your breweries? So thank you for coming today. And yeah, see you at the next webinar. Thank you, Gabriel. Thanks to the whole team behind us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.